Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you tuning in from wherever you are. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I'm Senior Vice President and Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS. We are very pleased to have with us today Spencer Dale, Chief Economist at BP, to present this year's Energy Outlook. Now, it's September, and as many of you know, we usually present a whole host of energy outlooks over the course of the year, and this is the first one we're doing for 2020. But to suffice to say, 2020 has been a very abnormal year. Even before a global pandemic, the energy transition was underway with lots of really profound but fairly uneven changes taking place in the global energy system. And then we had COVID-19, a global pandemic that has heretofore had some pretty large impacts on both people and their behavior, but also the global economy. And so the stakes are pretty high for the energy industry. There's a lot to be analyzed. And I think one of the questions before all of us today is whether or not 2020 is going to be a pivot point in our transition to a low carbon economy or just an asterisk, one of those sort of outlier years. And so I think we're going to talk a lot about those questions in this energy outlook today. And we are very pleased to have this outlook to serve as a guide and a frame for us to be able to explore some of those issues. Now, before I turn the stage over to Spencer, I just want to remind everybody tuning in, if you'd like to ask a question, please go to the website and click the button that says Ask Question, and then you can ask the question. There's a record number of people tuning in today, so I encourage you to get your questions in early so we'll have a chance to review them. And then finally, just a plea to the audience, please don't judge my humble surroundings of my home office relative to Spencer in his fancy studio. Hopefully the juxtaposition won't be too harsh. But Spencer, thank you so much for joining us, and we're really pleased to have you here for this discussion today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, CSIS, for hosting me today. And thank all of you for joining us online. I know watching online is not quite the same thing, but the issues surrounding the energy transition are hugely fascinating, and I don't think have ever been any more important. So thank you, and please do keep on posting your questions so we can have a good Q&A session at the end. So the plan is I'm going to try and restrict my comments to a maximum of 30 minutes, so we have plenty of time for the Q&A, which I think is always the most interesting. We published our new energy outlook, delayed. It was delayed from February. We published it last week. One of the reasons why it was delayed was because of COVID and the need to update it for COVID. But it was also delayed because BP was announcing its new strategy, and the energy outlook was feeding in to the new strategy. So one of the things I want to say today a little bit is sort of a slight point on methodology about how we were using the energy outlook to help shape BP's new strategy. And also I want to say a little bit of time to highlight some of the other issues that we talk about in the outlook. As always, I'm only going to have time to touch a brief surface of the issues that are in the new outlook. It's the biggest and I think the most ambitious outlook that I've ever been involved in. So if I do whet your appetite, please do go online and look at the booklet in full. There's loads more information than I can even start to do justice on today. So if we go to the next slide, Ian. The outlook is framed in terms of three key scenarios shown in this next slide, which is just coming up, I think. These three scenarios shown here in terms of their implications for carbon emissions. One scenario, which we call rapid, shown here in orange, assumes there's a significant increase in carbon prices and other carbon policies, such that carbon emissions fall by around 70% from their current levels by 2050. Net zero, shown here in blue, which assumes those increases in carbon prices and policies are further compounded by a significant shift in behavioral preferences and behaviors, such that which further accelerate the reduction in carbon emissions. And as the name suggests, carbon emissions are almost entirely eliminated by 2050 in net zero. And the third scenario is business as usual, shown here in green, which assumes that policies, technology, and consumer preferences continue to improve at the rate seen over the recent past. That improvement is consistent with carbon emissions, enough for carbon emissions to peak by the mid-2020s, but does little in terms of decarbonising the energy system, with carbon emissions by 2050 around just 10% below their current levels. A key point up front here is all of these scenarios are wrong. We don't think any one of these scenarios is any more likely than any other of the scenarios, and we're fully aware that we can't predict the future, and so none of these scenarios will materialize. Rather, what we're doing is using these scenarios throughout the booklet to help get a better understanding about the nature of the uncertainty we face. And then we use that that understanding of the uncertainty to help inform BP's strategy in a way that hopefully that strategy can be robust and resilient to the range of outcomes that we face. And I'll say a little bit more about that sort of resilience and that approach to resilience in a moment. If we move to the next slide. In the booklet, we show how we can use the scenarios. We can compare these scenarios with the scenarios which were contained in the last year's report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we can use those scenarios collected by the IPCC to back out pathway or confidence bands for different, to see how our scenarios compare with the Paris climate goals. So you can see here that the rapid scenario is broadly in the middle of the pink swathe derived from the IPCC scenarios, which are judged to be consistent with maintaining temperature rises well below 2 degrees C. So the rapid scenario pretty much in the middle of the pack of scenarios consistent with maintaining temperatures well below 2 degrees C. And we compared the net zero scenario with the blue swathe, which is consistent with scenarios which maintain temperature rises below 1.5 degrees C. You can see the pace at which carbon emissions in net zero decline is a little bit slower than that blue swathe initially, but by the end of the outlook is pretty much in line, is pretty much towards the bottom end of that 1.5 degree range. And so that's how these scenarios compare with those Paris climate goals, how we think about that with rapid, broadly consistent with IPCC scenarios, consistent with well below 2, and net zero, broadly consistent with IPCC scenarios, broadly consistent with maintaining temperature rises below 1.5 degrees. These are the scenarios for the global carbon emissions. If we move to the next slide. This slide shows you how those three scenarios compare for the US, with the fall in carbon emissions in rapid for the US, carbon emissions falling by around 85%. So a little bit stronger than the global average, which is consistent with the view that in terms of these sort of decarbonisation pathways, we see relatively mature, rich, developed economies decarbonising more quickly, allowing greater space for the emerging economies to continue to grow and decarbonize slightly less quickly. So around an 85% reduction in US carbon emissions in rapid, again, almost entire reduction in carbon emissions in net zero. And in the business as usual scenario, carbon emissions falling by around a third. So again, a stronger reduction in carbon emissions than seen for the global average, but still nowhere near the type of the reduction in emissions we'd need to see to be consistent with those Paris climate goals. If we move to the next slide, what I wanted to do today is try and focus around 5 questions which we deal with in the outlook. First, huge amounts of uncertainty in terms of the energy transition and how the energy system is likely to evolve. But what do we know about how the energy system may evolve? Are there some things that we can be more confident about? Secondly, what is the prospects for oil demand? When we published the outlook last week, there was lots of attention associated with peak oil and whether the oil demand has peaked. I don't think that's a particularly interesting question, so I'm going to spend a few moments saying why I don't think that's that question is particularly interesting. Third, what role could natural gas play in the energy transition? Fourth, as we move to a lower carbon energy system, what role and how important could the emergence of both hydrogen and bioenergy be? And finally, if I have time, hopefully, trying to consider just briefly, what are the dangers of delaying the energy transition, about if movements to a more sustainable path are delayed for the next 5 or 10 years. So that's sort of the running order for the next 25 minutes or so. So if we start with this first question about what do we know, one way of thinking about this question is trying to look for trends or features of the energy system which are common across all three of the scenarios I just outlined. Although those three scenarios are by no means comprehensive, they do cover a fairly substantial span of uncertainty. And so if we see some features which are common across all three scenarios, that may give us some confidence that they are likely to materialize in some form or other. So can we identify features of the energy system common across all three of those scenarios? And what we what we show in the booklet, there are three features in particular of energy demand which are common across all three of those scenarios. The first feature, if we move to the next slide, is the declining role of fossil fuels. So this chart shows the share of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal in primary energy, and it shows how that share declines over time. So today, fossil fuels accounts for around 85% of primary energy, and in the three scenarios, it declines to somewhere between 65 and 20%, depending on which scenario you're in. Importantly, in all three of those scenarios, the absolute demand for fossil fuels declines over the next 30 years. This would be entirely unprecedented. In the modern history of energy, there's never been a fall in the absolute demand for any traded energy. The shares of oil and coal have declined over time, but the absolute demand of oil and coal have continued to rise. In all three scenarios, that changes with the demand for fossil fuels falling in all three scenarios, so moving into unprecedented territories, even in a business as usual case. If we move to the next slide, Ian, the second feature is as the share and the importance of fossil fuels declines, that's offset by an increasing growth of renewable energy. So here, renewables is associated with wind and solar power, bioenergy, and geothermal energy. We discuss hydropower separately in the outlook. So we're just focusing here on those three energy sources. Today, that accounts for around 5% of primary energy. And again, in all three scenarios, that share rises to somewhere between 20 and 60% by 2050. In doing so, renewable energy penetrates the energy system more quickly than any fuel ever seen in history. Again, that's true. There's faster penetration ever seen in history. Again, consistent feature across all three of these scenarios. And the third feature, if we move to the next slide, Ian, is an increasing role of electricity in total final energy consumption as the world electrifies. Again, a common feature across all three. So although exactly how the energy system will evolve over the next 30 years is hugely uncertain with massive uncertainty bands, one of our core beliefs that we sort of identify in the energy outlook is it's likely to be accompanied by these three characteristics: a declining role of fossil fuels, an increasing share of renewable energy with very strong growth in renewable energy, supported and going hand in hand with increasing electrification of the energy system. Another way into this question of saying, what do we know, is rather than looking for common trends across the scenarios, is to think about how may the energy system change if and when we move to a lower carbon energy system, when we start to have that transition to a lower carbon energy system. So if you move to the next chart, Ian. This chart focuses on rapid. So to remind you, that rapid scenario is a scenario consistent with carbon emissions falling broad in line with what's necessary to maintain temperature rises well below 2 degrees C. And I don't want to focus on the specifics of rapid here, because the precise profiles will vary across different scenarios. There's nothing special about rapid. What I want to do here is try and highlight some of the generic features which are going on in a low carbon energy transition as portrayed by something like a rapid scenario. And what you can see here, that this chart is different to every other chart in the Energy Outlook, because it starts in 1900. So this covers a wide span of history. And the point of covering a wide span of history is just to remind us that for much of modern history, the energy system has been dominated by one or two sources of energy. So for the first half of the 20th century, energy system was dominated by coal, shown by that black line there, which by far and away was had the dominant share of primary energy. As the share of coal declined in the 60s and into the 70s, oil, shown in green, had an increasingly dominant role. What we expect to see as we move to a lower carbon energy system is a period, which you can see here for rapid in the 2020s and 2030s, where you see a far more diverse energy mix with oil, natural gas, wind and renewables, coal, other non-fossil fuels, all providing a significant share of world energy. And importantly, that more diverse energy mix being driven by customer choice rather than the availability of fuels, which has been the dominant driver over the last 100 years. So rather than the energy mix being driven by the supply side in terms of what's the availability, increasingly being driven by customer choice. That greater diversity of fuels is likely to need greater integration across those fuels. So where these energy markets need far more integration services. And these energy markets also may become more localized, because alongside these fuels, there's an increasing role for electricity, and over time also for hydrogen, which I'll come on to say more about in a moment. Those energy carriers, more costly, more inefficient to transport long distances, so the market's becoming more localized. Another final feature of these markets changing over time is we're likely to see increasing competition within these markets. First of all, we're likely to see increasing competition across fuels. As you can see here, when you have all of these fuels providing significant amounts of energy, we're likely to see more competition across those fuels. So within the power sector, between coal, natural gas, renewables, and also other non-fossil fuels like hydropower and nuclear power. And also within individual fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas, with resource owners of those fuels competing to ensure their fuels are produced and consumed against this backdrop of falling demand for oil, coal, and in rapid natural gas as well. So this increasing competition leading to a shift in economic rents, with economic rents moving away from upstream producers, increasingly going towards consumers. So some generic features of how we think the energy system may evolve as we move to a low carbon we move to a lower carbon energy system. Again, nothing special per se here about the rapid, but some of these generic features likely to be common across many scenarios. So as we move to a low carbon energy system, a shift to a more diversified fuel mix driven increasingly by customer choice, the center of gravity shifting away from upstream producers, increasingly towards energy consumers, greater need for integration, more localized energy markets, and heightened competition with the profit share shifting away from upstream producers to increasingly towards consumers in the form of lower, more competitive energy. So if we shift back into the next slide, that's very quickly in terms of how we were thinking about looking for some of these sort of common trends and things that we think we can be more confident about than materializing in one form or another. We turn to the next question in terms of the outlook for oil demand. If we go to the next slide, Ian. This chart shows the profile for oil demand in those three scenarios. And we start from a world today where oil demand has been very significantly impacted by COVID, both in terms of the economic impacts of COVID and also some of the behavioral changes that COVID has struck as people have traveled less, switched the modes of transportation, and also working from home more. In two of the scenarios, rapid and net zero, although oil demand does recover somewhat as the impact of COVID is assumed to lessen and the virus is brought under control, it never gets back to its pre-COVID levels. And so in those two scenarios, the impact of COVID has had the impact of bringing forward the peak in oil demand to 2019. It never gets back to its pre-COVID levels. In rapid and net zero, oil demand continues to declining to around 50 million barrels a day by 2050 in rapid, and to around 25 million barrels a day by 2050 in net zero. In contrast, in business as usual, oil demand does recover to above its pre-COVID levels. It remains around that levels or around 100 million barrels a day for the next 10 or 15 years before gradually declining in the back half of the outlook to end around 90 million barrels a day by 2050. In all three scenarios, the single biggest driver of that reduction in oil demand is the increasing efficiency and the increasing electrification of road transportation. The increasing efficiency and electrification of road transportation accounts for around 50 to 60% of the reduction in oil demand in rapid and net zero, and an even greater proportion in business as usual. So that's the driver of what's causing oil demand to fall. So as I said, when I launched the Energy Outlook last week from London, I mentioned that in two of the scenarios, the impact of COVID had caused oil demand to peak, and this led to a number of people becoming excited about peak oil demand. And I must admit, from a personal perspective, my response to has oil demand peaked is I don't know, is one response, and the second response is I don't think it's a particularly interesting question. So let me say why I don't know and why I don't think it's a particularly interesting question. In terms of why I don't know, is I've shown you here two scenarios in which oil demand has peaked and another scenario where it hasn't peaked. And there's literally countless other scenarios, infinite number of other scenarios, some of which where oil demand would have peaked and some of which it would not have peaked. So has oil demand peaked? I don't know. In some scenarios, yes. In some scenarios now, no. And I know I can't predict the future, so I don't know which of these scenarios is more or less accurate. And so the simple answer to that is we don't know. The second question is, I don't think it's really very interesting, because when I'm thinking about a strategy for BP, which is robust and resilient across these range of outcomes, that strategy doesn't depend on whether oil demand peaked in 2019 or 2022 or 2025 or 2030. That's not what the issue is. The issue here, if you think about that range of demand profiles shown by these scenarios, is we're trying to pick a strategy which is robust, say, over the next 10 years, to oil demand continuing to recovering to its pre-COVID levels and remaining around that 100 million barrels a day level for the next 10 or 15 years. Again, and a lower bound where oil demand over the next 10 years declines for about 10 million barrels a day. That's what a robust strategy is, trying to think about a strategy which is robust to that range of uncertainty. And the particular peaking isn't such an important issue. Another point to note here is often that people think, well, once oil demand's peaked, that somehow it will suddenly play no role in the oil system going forward. But you can see here, even once oil demand has peaked, it continues to play a very significant role in the energy system for many years to come. And if we move on to the next slide, Ian. This chart here compares those three oil demand profiles shown in the three colors there with that dotted with a dotted line, which shows you a hypothetical supply of oil profile in a world in which there was no more investment in new greenfield oil sites. And as you can see, without significant investment in new oil production, we wouldn't be able to produce enough oil to meet even that scenario in net zero, where oil demand is declining really quite rapidly. So even in a world where oil demand has already declined and it's on a profile consistent with achieving a net zero by 2050, consistent with 1.5 degrees, we're still likely to require trillions and trillions of dollars of investment in new upstream oil production over the next 10 or 15 years. If we move to the next question, that concerns what role does natural gas play in the energy transition? If we move to the first slide, Ian, this chart shows that same profile I just showed you for oil demand, for the demand for natural gas. And you can see here, for each of the scenarios, the outlook for natural gas is far more resilient. If you pick, for example, the rapid scenario shown here by the orange bar in the middle, I just showed you for oil demand, or the demand for oil in rapid had peaked in 2019 and fell by around 50% by 2050. In contrast, in this scenario here, natural gas demand in rapid, natural gas demand continues to grow for the next 15 years or so. It then starts to gradually decline, but it only declines back to a level a little below its current level. So a far stronger, more resilient outlook. And this more resilient outlook for natural gas reflects two features of the role that natural gas plays in a low carbon transition. The first feature, which we explore in quite a lot of detail in the booklet, is what I call the supporting role for natural gas. And the supporting role for natural gas particularly occurs in emerging economies, particularly, for example, in Asia, where energy demand is growing very rapidly. In that scenario, as you try to decarbonize the energy system, and in particular try to reduce the role of coal in the energy system, it's very difficult for wind and solar power and other renewable energy to grow sufficiently quickly to both meet the growth of new energy, to meet the new energy demand, and at the same time also replace coal. And so in that world where you're having a relatively rapid decarbonization, you're trying to reduce the role of coal, at the same time meet the increasing demand for new energy, massive growth for strong growth in renewables, but at the same time also needing a significant role growth in the role of natural gas to support and complement the role of renewables. And I was just mentioning to Sarah before we came on air, I spoke to a group of senior business leaders in India this morning, and were highlighting this. And for India, the growth of natural gas in rapid is actually stronger than the growth of natural gas in business as usual, because it's playing this role of helping to displace coal to allow India to decarbonize more rapidly. So one part of this resilience of natural gas is this supporting role for natural gas, particularly in fast-growing emerging economies where energy demand is growing quickly and you need it to help support that decarbonisation and that reduction of coal. The second component, which is shown here on the next slide, Ian, is the increasing role that natural gas plays as a source of near zero carbon energy when combined with CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage. And in rapid and net zero, natural gas with CCUS accounts for around between 8 and 10% of primary energy by 2050. Much of natural gas with CCUS acting as a direct source of energy use, particularly in industry and in the power sector, but also some of it being used to produce so-called blue hydrogen, where the hydrogen is extracted from the natural gas and the carbon emissions are stored with CCUS. And that's playing an increasing role, particularly in net zero. So that's the big picture is natural gas more resilient than oil. And the two factors associated or driving that resilience, A, this supporting role for natural gas, helping to decarbonize and reduce the role of coal in emerging economies. And secondly, this role of natural gas as a source of near zero carbon energy when combined with CCUS. The next question I want to speak to, if we go to the next slide, is the role of hydrogen and bioenergy. So let's say a little bit more about this role of hydrogen and bioenergy as the world moves to a low carbon energy system. When thinking about the sort of the key features of a low carbon transition, the starting point is to decarbonize the power sector and then electrify as many end uses as you possibly can. And that's sort of the key component of any decarbonization pathway. But there are some types of energy uses and activities which can't be easily or efficiently electrified. And this provides a role for hydrogen and bioenergy as a complement to electrification, providing energy sources to those activities which can't easily be electrified. If we move to the next slide, Ian. For hydrogen, shown here, in rapid and net zero, hydrogen provides about 6% of total final energy consumption in rapid and around 15% in net zero. And as you can see from these slides here, a significant amount of that hydrogen going into a combination of industry, particularly to support high temperature processes, industrial processes, which are hard to electrify, and also into transportation, shown in the light blue bar here, particularly long distance road transportation, which is hard to electrify. And so increasingly you see the use of hydrogen and fuel cell trucks within transport in those two scenarios. If we bring up the next slide, Ian, that's the demand side. In terms of the production side shown on the right, we expect to see broadly equal proportions of hydrogen produced via so-called blue hydrogen, which I just talked to you about, mainly produced by natural gas combined with carbon capture, use and storage, together with green hydrogen, which is here made with the electrolysis of water using renewable energy. And we envisage both of those energy forms playing a significant role in the production of hydrogen by 2050 in both these scenarios. I'm very happy to talk more about the sort of the relative cost profiles of blue and green hydrogen we envisage over the outlook in the Q&A session. If we move to the next slide, we also see an increasing role for bioenergy in both rapid and net zero, accounting between 8 and 10% of primary energy by 2050 in the two scenarios. And bioenergy here, the biggest single form of bioenergy is biomass in the light green bars here, going into the power sector, but also a significant role for liquid biofuels, particularly in long distance and transportation, and also the growth of biomethane, which can act as a direct substitute for natural gas across the whole range of different sectors. So as the world electrifies and decarbonize the power sector and electrifies as many things as it can, we can't electrify everything. And so as we move to that low carbon energy system, you'll need growing support from both hydrogen and bioenergy, providing that extra source of energy. And very quickly, if I can do one more, just do the final question, which is in terms of the dangers of delaying the energy transition. Both rapid and net zero are based on the assumption that the world starts to take actions and policies relatively quickly, such that carbon emissions start to fall over the next few years. But in reality, those actions may be delayed for quite some time, and we may continue upon our current unsustainable path for a prolonged and extended period. And we explore that possibility in more detail in another scenario called the delayed and disorderly scenario, which is if we move to the next, shown in this next slide. So what the delayed and disorderly scenario assumes is that the world continues to move along the business as usual path for the next 10 years until 2030. And then at 2030, it's sufficient actions and policies are implemented such that cumulative carbon emissions over the entire energy outlook are the same as in rapid. The reason for picking a cumulative carbon emissions target reflects the existence of a finite carbon budget. And the features of a finite carbon budget is that continuing high levels of carbon emissions in the near term have to be compensated for some point in the future by lower levels of carbon emissions. And so you can see that in this scenario, where the higher level of carbon emissions out to 2030 in delayed and disorderly are then compensated for by lower carbon emissions and in rapid further out. If we move to the next chart, the way the delayed and disorderly scenario is designed is the assumptions assume that there are real costs to delay. And in particular, what we assume is that you can't achieve a greater improvement in energy efficiency, and also you can't achieve a greater efficiency improvement in the fuel mix in delayed and disorderly by 2050 than is achieved in rapid. And an implication of that is if you can't reduce reductions by energy efficiency and you can't reduce emissions enough by improvements in the fuel mix, then the only way in this scenario you can achieve your required reduction in carbon emissions is by rationing of energy. So rationing the use of energy in activities and end uses in order to bring carbon emissions down. The particular features, that particular use of energy rationing is obviously incredibly stylized, and in reality, other types of options may be possible, such as various negative emissions technologies. But what we're trying to capture here is, in a world where if there's no magic wand, if you delay the costs you've delayed the timing of moving onto a sustainable path, then that's likely to lead to real costs and greater disruption. The underlying philosophy of delayed and disorderly is the belief that the longer you remain on an unsustainable path, the increasing likelihood that society will change and societal preferences will change such that it will trigger a decisive shift in carbon emissions. This idea that the longer you remain on this unsustainable path, the greater the probability that it comes to an end, can be dated back to the observation made by an American economist, Herbert Stein. And what Stein observed quite straightforwardly was, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. And Stein's law, although very simple, when applied to the current unsustainable path of the global energy system, has quite profound and important implications. If something can't go on forever, it will stop. Let me stop now, Sarah, hand back. I think, I overshot by a few minutes. Let me stop now, and hopefully I've left enough time for questions.
No, that's great. Thanks so much, Spencer. It's a lot to cover in 30 minutes, so I think you did a great job putting a lot on the table. If it's okay, what I'd like to do, we got a lot of questions coming in, so I've been able to compile them. I do want to sort of start where you stopped, however, on this delayed and disorderly, because I was remarking over the weekend as I was reading my latest edition of The Economist that there was a similarly themed article in that, which was sort of putting forth the idea that there's a lot of things that are very tricky about the energy transition that would lead one to say, no, we should probably be slower about the pace we're going, right? There are lots of tricky things, lots of hard things to accomplish. So let's take a measured approach. But they also observed that desire to take a more measured approach and to slow down could yield some unintended consequences. And I think in The Economist article, they were talking a lot about climate impacts as well, but you're talking about societal presumptions about needing to do something. One of the questions I had about your delayed and disorderly scenario is did you look into this? What would the impact on GDP be of a scenario like that?
We didn't have the courage to try and, well, not the courage, we just know when you don't know things, okay? So yeah. The underlying story here, and this is the important part here, was what we'd said was, in rapid, you make an enormous improvements in energy efficiency, and you make enormous improvements in the fuel mix, including a massive build out of CCUS. Mm-hmm. And what we say in business as usual, suppose you start 10 years later, in delayed and disorderly, you start 10 years later. Let's suppose, even though you got 2/3 of the time, you can get to the same, you get the same absolute improvement in efficiency and the same improvement in the fuel mix. Which you think, well, that's some going. You know, you got 2/3 of the time, you still get it. But if that's all you can do, you're in trouble if you want to have the same cumulative carbon emissions. And just that simple point and the degree of rationing that you just, as a matter of arithmetic, that comes out of this is huge. And so the distortions to GDP, by implication, are very material. We didn't try and put a sort of dollar value on that, because in some sense, at this point, this is so stylized. The point was, that didn't seem to me an outrageous assumption that you can, it seemed quite a push that you can make the same improvements in 2/3 of the time. But if that's all you can do, that leaves you with a problem. And the issue here is, this is only 10 years. This is not something if we don't get going over the next 30 or 40 years. In this scenario, if we want to hit that finite carbon budget by 2050, if we leave it for 10 years before we start making action, it has big impacts. And so it's one of those things that just as a sort of way of ordering our thought. So that was one point. And the other point was sort of, we're trying to pick, part of the essay question in some sense that Bernard Looney, our CEO, had given to me was, help us think about a robust strategy, Spencer. Help the Outlook do the robust strategy. This is when Stein's law is quite helpful or quite powerful. Right? We're on an unsustainable path. Something which is unsustainable will stop. And recognizing that has quite clear implications for thinking about what is a robust and resilient strategy for a company over the next 20 or 30 years.
So that would lead to my next question, and maybe without going back through all of the BP Week material, what is a company like yours supposed to take out of a outlook like this about a robust and resilient strategy?
I think it's one where, this is not, in some sense, there's a lot better people speaking for BP than I am. The strap line, which is a strap line, but I think is also an important one, is this shift from an international oil company to an integrated energy company. Now, I know that's a sort of strap line, but the point here is an integrated oil company focusing on producing upstream assets to an integrated energy company focused on providing customer solutions. And it sort of relates to those two bits I was saying at the beginning. Partly this is a function of the fuel mix. We think that the demand, the outlook for oil and gas will be challenged. It will play a significant role, but it will become increasingly challenged. Where on the other side, there's things associated with renewable energy, hydrogen, or wind and solar power, hydrogen, bioenergy growing very rapidly. So part of this is a pivot towards some of those fast-growing energy sources. But also it's a pivot in terms of how we think of ourselves as a company. The energy, the central gravity of energy systems are shifting. It's moving from where the power lies with upstream producers to customers. And in some sense, the other part of this pivot is pivoting our mindset away from being an upstream producer to somebody who provides customer solutions. And so I think those are two bits to my mind. One is the fuel mix itself, but also going hand in hand with that is the nature of energy systems, where up till now, it's been driven by the supply side. It's the upstream producers, it's the availability of energy. That energy has been scarce and it's defined many things. As you move to a far more diverse, plentiful, abundant energy, that's a completely different shift. And it's those two components, I think, were quite important in sort of shaping how BP thought about its pivot and its strategy.
That's great. I want to ask, I have a couple questions that are based on some of the stuff that's in the booklet that you didn't get a chance to talk about. And I do commend everyone to take a look at it, because there is a lot more sort of nuance and content in there. But I'm getting a ton of questions, like literally a ton of questions. I'm going to try and put like 7 of them together in this one question, which is fundamentally about infrastructure. So what are some of the infrastructure constraints or takeaways from this outlook? And by this, I mean, got a bunch of questions on whether or not, you didn't talk about it as much today as you did in the outlook, huge build out in renewables, right? There's a huge build out in renewables here. Did you take things like critical minerals into consideration when you were thinking about constraints on renewables? Is there a big takeaway here about pipeline infrastructure for this hydrogen and natural gas outlook? So maybe if you could just talk a couple big places in the outlook where infrastructure stands out to you as either there's constraints on this, therefore we modeled this, or what, how people should think about some of those issues.
So I think those infrastructure issues are very significant, and I think we have a go at trying to model those. The nature of our modeling system is not anywhere near as sophisticated, as impressive as somebody like the IEA would do. So they would have a lot better handle on these things than we do. You do need to see a significant increase in investment flows going into wind and solar power, and so there's a significant scaling up of those funds. And so we do have some estimates for investment for the first time ever. We've included an investment section in the outlook, and that has we sort of show that to meet those rapid and net zero scenarios, that's talking about levels of investment in wind and solar of the order between $500 and $750 billion a year. So enormous sums of money. And at one level, this seems mind-boggling. But another way level is that sort of number between $500 and $700 billion a year is roughly around 3% of business investment last year. Okay, so this is doable. This is perfectly doable if there's a collective will to direct those funds into that way. Another point which somebody made to me is a feature of this energy system, of this energy transition, is our energy is likely to become far more physical and in terms of awareness that people will have than our current energy system. So not many people, I would have thought, has perhaps ever seen a power station. You can drive for many hours in the UK without coming across a power station, and you can drive leak-wise. You can drive for quite some time without seeing a solar farm. This is a new world here, where we're going to see far more power stations as electricity grows. We're going to see far more land use taken up with solar power and with wind power. And part of that sort of changing societal preferences, which allows net zero to happen, is that society is willing for that to happen and doesn't fight it back, but embraces it. Also, we will need to see there is significant pipeline or infrastructure in terms of both hydrogen and also needed for CCUS, and how that's funded, how much government support there is, and how much public sort of resistance there is to that sort of building out of those new pipelines is also very significant going forward. So so this is view which I think many people are coalescing now is carbon pricing can do a lot of the work, but it's not going to be sufficient on their own, and there will also need some significant government in sort of support and planning on some of this infrastructure issues.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned, the net zero scenario that you have, and we are throwing around the term net zero a lot these days in energy conversations and policy conversations. There's actually a lot of differentiation between net zero outlooks, and you have a section, I think, in like page 131, according to my notes. So hopefully that's correct for those of you following along at home, where you do compare your net zero with the IPCC net zero. Can you talk through what some of the differences are?
Yeah, and so thank you. And it's a shame because I think this is one of the most interesting sections in the book. It's very hard to find time to explain it. So what the point here was sort of saying, hopefully the world is heading towards net zero. What does a net zero energy system look like? We have one particular net zero scenario, but that's relatively arbitrary. Everybody else have different ones. And also the nature of net zero is likely to continue to evolve over time. So what we do is, in the book, is we take all the scenarios included in the IPCC report, which at some point between now and 2100 get to net zero. And at the point when they get to net zero, we stop and say, right, what does the energy system look like there? In that one, and then we amalgamate them all together to get sort of bands of sort of confidence bands about the role that oil may play, the role that hydrogen may play, the role that renewables may play in providing in the power sector. Is it 100% renewables or somewhat less? And so, again, we don't know, but let's crowdsource by looking at ranges of scenarios. Again, using scenarios to help explain uncertainty rather than do point predictions. And it has a pretty similar features as ours. We see a significant increase in electrification with renewable wind and solar power providing the vast majority of that power generation, but not all of that power generation. In our scenarios, you get to about 65, 70% or 60% of power generation. That cost of intermittency starts to really bite, and so it flattens off, and you sort of see similar ranges within the IPCC scenarios. Big role for bioenergy, and in some sense a little bit more optimistic on bioenergy than in ours, and sort of conversely a little bit more subdued in terms of the role that hydrogen can play. But it's worth remembering a lot of these IPCC scenarios were sort of are quite dated now. Many of them are 4 or 5 years old, sort of before the third or fourth renaissance, or whatever we're on of hydrogen. The one bit which is sort of interesting, and I think this may tell you more about the difficulty of getting to net zero rather than an actual fact, is the role that they have for CCUS in those scenarios. So for us, if CCUS is accounting for around 5.5 gigatons of carbon emissions in net zero by 2050. In contrast, if I look at the range in the IPCC scenarios, it's between 8 and 18 gigatons. So those IPCC scenarios say you get to net zero by carbon capture, use and storage capturing between 1/4 and 1/2 of all carbon emissions. Now, I don't think I'd literally take that as sort of my best guess. I think that would be an enormous build out of carbon emissions. But I think what it does tell you is two things. One is it's very likely that CCUS is likely to need to play a significant role and a material role. And that's one bit of technology which we're not seeing develop as quickly as we need to. And the other one it tells you is it's very hard to get to net zero. And so for many modelers, sometimes your sort of get out of jail card is you use a bit more carbon capture, use and storage. And that's just sort of telling you that it's quite hard to get to net zero. And as a little sort of anecdote, when we're working on these different scenarios, I have different members of the team working on different components, and our team is a very friendly team. Everybody gets on really well. We got to net zero and everybody really started getting touchy with each other. And it's because you're trying to find a way of getting to net zero, and different bits, people say, no, I can't drive my bit any harder. I can't drive my bit any harder. And you're starting to see this tetchiness. And the point was, it was a manifestation of this is really having to push the energy system to points that we just haven't seen before. And it's harder to achieve. And to me, it was a sort of a way of confirming just how hard some of this stuff is as you try, first 40 or 50% of carbon emissions is doable, but it gets harder as you go further out. Consistent with this point is we need to get going now to give us a chance to get to give us a long time to get to some of those harder ones later on.
Thanks, Spencer. Yeah. So we've got about 7 minutes left and a zillion questions. So I'm going to do, again, try to compile a bunch of them. There's a lot of interest in how this outlook compares to other outlooks, your last year's outlook, other relative outlooks. I will say there is another slide that I had put on my question list in page 143 of your outlook, which does compare your outlook with another range of outlooks and IPCC ranges of outlooks. So there's a lot of interest in how this compares with last year, how this compares with others. My interesting insight, I don't know if it's interesting, but from that page is there's actually a very narrow range in which people think about nuclear power.
Yes, isn't that amazing?
I mean, it's like we have one thought as a universe about nuclear and hydro, and it's in this one small error bar range. So anyway, could you talk a little bit about how this outlook compares with some of the other ones in your previous ones?
And absolutely, and we've always, all the way for every energy outlook I've been involved in, we always have these sort of charts at the back, which says how to the extent we compare one scenario and another, how have we changed our view over time from one year to another, and equally important, how do we compare with others? And so in terms of sort of that story, the big shift from a year ago is COVID. We have a materially weaker profile for GDP as a result of COVID. And that pushes down across all energy sources. It disproportionately affects oil because some of those behave for two reasons. One is the COVID impacts bear materially or most significantly on emerging economies, and it's those emerging economies which are the only source of growth for oil. Moreover, some of these behavioral effects, particularly working from home, are concentrated within transport, which again manifests in oil. So you see impacts on oil, but also gas is weaker as well, with renewables stronger. And that just reflects a sort of judgment call that if you look back in history, renewables are far less cyclical, are far less sensitive to economic cycle than we see for those two ones. So that's the biggest single shift is that. Across comparing our outlooks with others, for Rapid, there's not our profile for when you compare Rapid with other 2-degree scenarios, our profile for oil demand is not materially different. Our outlook is weaker than many of the others because of COVID, but that profile for oil demand not materially significantly different from others. But gas a little bit stronger. A little bit stronger profile stronger for natural gas, and I think a little bit weaker for coal. And I think part of that story may well be that sort of supporting story I was telling you earlier, that the weaker coal goes sort of hand in hand with stronger natural gas, because we see that supporting role that natural gas is playing.
Spencer, we've got probably under 4 minutes here, so I want to pair one more set of questions. A lot of bioenergy questions, biofuel questions have come in. Two fundamental things here. One, how much does the use of biomass depend on localized markets, right? How much of this is a local demand story versus international? And two, for sustainable biofuels, do you just think that carbon prices get high enough to support their increased usage, or is there a material decline in their cost that you assume?
Yeah, I don't think some of my modelers will know the answer to the first question on I think biomass is, I mean, the biggest growth for bioenergy is for biomass, which is in the power sector, which is by its very nature relatively localized. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing with biomass is we also in net zero, we have a significant role of biomass combined with CCS in terms of BECCS providing a negative emissions. And that becomes sort of quite economically desirable, because you've got sort of two income streams, if you like. You've got it's a way of both providing energy and also providing negative emissions. And so the attractiveness of that is really quite significant. I think for biofuels, we're not assuming a significant technology breakthrough. So I think it is more driven by the carbon price, and the IEA had their technology perspectives. They published it a week or 10 days ago, mm-hmm. and once you finish reading the Energy Outlook, I also commend you to go and read that. And the point, which is, again, as always, the IEA unbelievably impressive. And one of the points they make there is the big sort of challenge for biofuels is to find ways of using the abundant sort of waste and residue materials. And so that's sort of the bit which we have to see for biofuels, is finding ways of sort of using better use of the waste and residue.
Excellent. Well, listen, we've got a lot of more questions, and I apologize to colleagues out there who we weren't able to get to their questions. I'm sure BP will make available other opportunities to ask Spencer questions too. So we have a hard stop, so I want to make sure that we honor that. Spencer, thank you very much for spending time doing the Outlook with us. We're sorry you can't be here in person. It's beautiful here in Washington, D.C., so we'll just have to have you come back another time when we're able to do that again. But thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, CSIS, and thank you everyone for hanging on online from a very sort of quiet and eerily empty room in DP's offices in London, where I think I'm one of about 10 people in. So I'd much rather be enjoying the gorgeous fall in DC. So hopefully next year I'll be able to enjoy it. So until then, thank you so much, Sarah, and everyone for participating and sparing the time. Really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us.